There are games where the final score tells you everything you need to know, and then there are games where the final score is almost insulting in how little it reveals. 86-77, Indiana Fever over the Phoenix Mercury. Clean, simple, decisive. Except nothing about what unfolded inside Gainbunge Fieldhouse that night was any of those things. What actually happened was messier, more intense, more chaotic, and honestly, more fascinating than any two-digit numbers could ever communicate. There were ejections, there were technical fouls, there was trash talk that had the crowd losing their minds. There was a 16-point deficit that nobody saw coming. And right in the middle of all of it, one player did something that quietly became the most important individual development of Indiana's entire season. If you only looked at the box score, you missed the actual story. So let's talk about what really went down. Before we get into the individual moments and the specific controversies that this game generated, it's worth stepping back and understanding what kind of game this was from the very first possession, because the context matters enormously. The Phoenix Mercury did not travel to Indianapolis with their heads down, already mentally conceding the result. They didn't show up hoping to keep it respectable and catch an early flight home. They arrived with a game plan, a deliberate, physical, confrontational game plan designed specifically to make the Indiana Fever uncomfortable from the opening tip. And at the center of that plan was Alyssa Thomas. Thomas is an Olympian. She is one of the most physically confrontational interior players in this entire league, and she has been for years. She plays with an edge that borders on intimidating, and she brought every ounce of that edge to Indiana's floor. From the earliest possessions, Thomas was setting the tone for what kind of game this was going to be. Not a clean, well-spaced execution basketball game, a war. A physical, grinding, get-in-your-face-and-see-what-you're-made-of kind of contest. And Phoenix's broader approach matched that energy throughout the roster. This was a team that had clearly decided their best chance at pulling an upset wasn't to out-execute Indiana, it was to out-tough them, to test whether the Fever's players would absorb physicality, back down from confrontation, or blink when things got uncomfortable. What happened next gave them their answer almost immediately, and the answer was not the one Phoenix was hoping for. Here's where the first major storyline of the night explodes into the game and changes its entire shape. Maisha Hines-Allen, one of Indiana's rotation players and someone who has been a genuinely valuable piece of this team's competitive infrastructure, was ejected. Gone, sent to the locker room before this contest had even had a chance to fully develop its rhythm. And the reason she was ejected is the part that demands honest examination, rather than a quick gloss over. When Alyssa Thomas brought her physical aggression to Indiana's floor, Hines-Allen was not the kind of competitor who was going to absorb it silently and let it continue unchallenged. She engaged, she pushed back, she did exactly what the competitive environment seemed to be calling for in that moment, and the officials intervened, and she was the one who left. Think about that for a second. The player who was on the receiving end of escalating physical engagement was removed from the game. The player whose approach set the confrontational tone remained on the floor. That's the kind of officiating outcome that frustrates players, coaches, and honest analysts equally, because it sends a signal about what is and isn't being protected in these environments. And here's the thing that makes it particularly pointed in the context of this specific team's season. The Indiana Fever and the players around Caitlin Clark have been at the center of a documented, ongoing conversation all year about how physical play directed at their roster is officiated versus how physical responses from their roster are officiated. That conversation didn't start with this Mercury game. It has been building for months. The Hines-Allen ejection added another data point to it. But Indiana couldn't dwell on it. They had lost a rotation player. The game was continuing. And what happened in the middle of this chaotic, physical environment was the moment that would generate the most individual conversation from this entire contest.
Caitlin Clark and Diana Taurasi may own the historical version of the veteran-rookie competitive dynamic in this league, but what unfolded between Clark and Dearica Hamby this game had its own energy entirely. Actually, let's be precise here, because the details matter. The interaction that generated the most significant buzz from this contest was Clark and Dana Bonner, and it was exactly the kind of moment that reveals what competitive professional basketball actually looks and feels like beneath the choreographed highlight packages. Both players were making threes. Both players were bringing genuine offensive firepower to their perimeter battle. The basketball between them was legitimately good, legitimately competitive, and legitimately entertaining. And alongside the basketball, there was communication. Real, direct, back and forth, competitive communication of the kind that has existed in professional basketball since the sport was invented. Bonner is a veteran. She has been in this league long enough to know every dimension of competitive engagement, including the verbal ones. She made a three-pointer, and she turned to Clark with something to say about it. That's the moment. That's the exchange that the internet has been replaying and discussing. And in the aftermath of that interaction, Clark received a technical foul. Now, here is where the honest, analytical observation has to be made with real precision, because glossing over it in either direction would be intellectually dishonest. The documented pattern throughout the season has shown consistently that Clark is held to a stricter standard than other players when it comes to competitive, emotional expression on the basketball court. Other players in this exact game were engaged in similar exchanges, similar verbal back and forths, similar competitive communication. The technical foul landed on Clark. Whether that specific call was correct by the actual letter of the rule book, or whether it reflects the broader pattern of asymmetric standard application that this season has established around Clark's emotional expression on the court, is genuinely impossible to answer with full confidence in only one direction. The evidence cuts both ways, and reasonable analysts disagree. What is not debatable is that Clark received a technical foul, that it arrived in the middle of a physically confrontational game environment that Phoenix had deliberately constructed from the opening tip, and that it did not derail her for even a single possession. She went right back to work. 24 points in 29 minutes, plus 13 rating. 3 turnovers, 1 missed free throw. She played through the ejection of a teammate, through the technical foul, through the physical environment, through the confrontational atmosphere, and she produced at a level that kept Indiana ahead and ultimately carried them to the win. That last sequence of facts is the one that deserves to be read slowly, because it is the most important thing that happened in that building that night. But before we go deeper into Clark's individual performance and what it means in the broader arc of her season, there is a player whose contribution to this specific game demands its own honest accounting: Sophie Cunningham. And the reason Cunningham's role in this game deserves specific attention is because of what the game actually required, not just from a statistical standpoint, but from a competitive character standpoint. When a game gets physical, when the environment escalates beyond clean basketball into something more confrontational and emotionally charged, teams need players who won't flinch, who will show up to that environment and match it rather than shrink from it. Cunningham has been that player for Indiana across this entire season, and she was absolutely that player in this Mercury game. With Hines-Allen ejected and her protective presence removed from the rotation, Cunningham stepped into the void. She brought energy, she brought physical willingness to match what Phoenix was imposing. She provided Clark with a teammate who was genuinely, completely present in the competitive environment, rather than operating at a comfortable distance from it. And that matters in ways that never show up in a box score. Because when the game requires something beyond clean execution, beyond the X's and O's on the whiteboard, you need players who understand what that something is and deliver it anyway. Cunningham has been that player consistently. And the broader story of Cunningham's season-long contribution adds even more weight to what she brought to this particular game. She was the player who went public about the team's defensive scheme. She was the player whose Instagram post generated organizational response and conversation that rippled through the entire franchise. Throughout this entire chaotic, controversial, unprecedented season, Cunningham has been the teammate most visibly and most consistently willing to stand alongside Clark in competitive and organizational environments that would test the loyalty of almost anyone. This Mercury game tested that loyalty again. The physical environment, the confrontational atmosphere, the ejection, the technical. She showed up. She delivered. and Indiana is a better team in moments like these specifically because of the kind of competitor she is. Now, let's talk about the full team performance picture, because the win is real and deserves honest accounting, alongside everything complicated about how it was achieved. And the most important thing to understand about this game's competitive arc, before we break down individual contributions, is that the final score of 86-77 does not tell you that the Phoenix Mercury, a team entering this game at 5 wins and 12 losses, built a 16-point lead against Indiana inside Indiana's own building. Let that land for a moment. A 5-12 team had Indiana down 16 on Indiana's floor, in a game where Indiana was favored, where Indiana had the superior roster, where Indiana had Caitlin Clark. A 16-point deficit is not a minor variance. It is not a team having a slightly off quarter and needing to refocus. It is a team being genuinely outplayed for a sustained stretch of time by an opponent whose record says they should not be capable of imposing themselves at that level against this roster. And this was not the first time something like this has happened with this Indiana team. The competitive susceptibility to being outplayed by opponents who appear lesser on paper has been a recurring characteristic of this team's season. They have the individual talent to overcome those deficits. Clark's presence alone makes them capable of erasing leads that would be insurmountable for most teams. But the fact that the deficits keep appearing in the first place is a competitive pattern that honest analysis can't keep overlooking just because the outcomes have been favorable enough often enough. Indiana came back from 16 down. They built their own advantage of 21. They eventually won by 9. The arc of this single game contained both a significant Indiana collapse and a significant Indiana resurgence. That is not the competitive profile of a team with a consistent, reliable competitive identity. That is the competitive profile of a team's individual talent is good enough to bail them out of the holes their systemic vulnerabilities keep digging. Against a 5-12 team, that approach works. Against playoff-caliber opponents in October, it will not be enough. And that distinction is the honest competitive reality that one win over the Mercury does not change. Now, let's go back to Clark's individual performance with the level of analytical depth it actually deserves. Because what she did in this game was not just good, it was specifically, meaningfully responsive to the biggest individual criticism she had faced heading into this contest. After the second Atlanta game, Clark had 7 turnovers. 7 in a losing effort against a team Indiana should have beaten. The criticism of her decision-making and ball security in that performance was analytically grounded and honestly delivered. She had too many turnovers, it hurt the team, the execution had to improve. And Clark came into the Mercury game with what looked like a clear, deliberate intention to address that specific problem. 3 turnovers in this game, down from 7, in a game that was physically confrontational, emotionally heightened, and more difficult to manage compositionally than a clean, normal-paced basketball game. The lower turnover total did not come under easier conditions. It came under harder ones. That is what makes it meaningful as an individual adjustment and not just a statistical fluctuation. The three-point shooting was not efficient. 3 of 10 from beyond the arc is not the kind of perimeter performance that will carry Indiana when they need her shooting at full capacity. But the 24 points still materialized through overall field goal efficiency of 8 of 17, through free throw conversion, and through something specifically worth noting because it represents genuine offensive evolution: the post fadeaway. The pull-up from the mid-range area, executed with technical precision that suggests deliberate development work rather than in-game improvisation. This shot is becoming a real weapon in Clark's offensive toolkit, and the reason its development matters so much for Indiana's long-term offensive ceiling is about what it forces defenders to account for. Right now, opponents defend Clark with the primary assumption that she is a perimeter shooter and a pick-and-roll creator. Her pull-up three and her drive and kick are the threats that defensive game plans are built around. When the mid-range fadeaway becomes reliable enough to consistently demand defensive attention and adjustment, it opens up every other element of her game in ways that make her exponentially harder to contain. The shot is developing. It showed up in a meaningful moment in this game, and the defensive implications of its continued development are significant for where this offense is capable of going.
Monique Billings produced 14 points and 10 rebounds, a genuine double-double, and the honest accounting of that performance requires acknowledging it without reservation, even in the context of everything that has been documented about Billings's inconsistency this season. The deployment questions, the fourth quarter unavailability that has generated real frustration, the performance inconsistencies that have characterized her time in Indianapolis and made her front office investment a complicated analytical subject all year. 14 and 10 against Alyssa Thomas, one of the more physically capable interior players in this league, is the kind of production the original investment in Billings was designed to generate. Whether this specific performance represents the beginning of more consistent output or an isolated strong individual showing surrounded by less impressive ones will be answered by subsequent games. But the contribution was real. It was meaningful, and honest analysis credits it clearly rather than burying it under accumulated season-long skepticism. Kelsey Mitchell produced 22 points. The highest compensated player on this roster outside of Aaliyah Boston contributed productive scoring output in a game Indiana needed to win. The analytical questions that have followed Mitchell throughout this season are not erased by one strong individual performance. The pass-first tendencies that sometimes don't align with the collaborative offensive execution this team needs, the shot selection patterns that occasionally prioritize individual accumulation over collective efficiency. These are real concerns that require real answers over the full body of evidence, not just one night's box score. But 22 points in a meaningful game is a real contribution, and it belongs in the honest competitive accounting of what produced the win. Aaliyah Boston did not have a great individual night, and the team victory cannot be allowed to obscure that, because the pattern it reflects is becoming analytically urgent. Back-to-back games where Boston was genuinely outplayed by Angel Reese and then by Nos Hillman, followed now by a Mercury performance that did not represent the dominance her compensation level and her individual talent suggest she should be generating at this stage of the season. 3 consecutive underwhelming performances from a player of Boston's caliber is a pattern that requires direct engagement from the coaching staff and the analytical community equally. And the specific reason the pattern is worth examining carefully is tied to the philosophical deployment decision that Stephanie White's hub offense has made around Boston's positioning. The system has moved her away from the interior positions where her footwork, her post skill, and her close-range scoring represent her most genuine and most powerful competitive strengths. The three-point line deployment is analytically interesting as a spacing concept, but it has coincided with the disappearance of the short-range conversion reliability that Boston demonstrated in earlier seasons, and that this offense genuinely needs from her. The experiment is worth questioning. The results to this point suggest it may be costing Indiana more than it's giving them. And the broader offensive execution in this game supports that concern. The team shot 29% from three-point range. The overall field goal percentage was 42% in a winning effort. When you win by 9 while shooting 42% overall, the victory is built more on the opponent's inability to sustain their own advantage than on your team executing its offensive system with the precision that actually matters. The Mercury had Indiana down 16 and couldn't hold it. That is the real explanation for the final score, and it's an honest distinction that the winning number on the scoreboard cannot be allowed to conceal indefinitely.
23 personal fouls for Indiana, 25 for Phoenix, 4 technical fouls assessed on Indiana across the course of the game. Those numbers tell you something about the competitive environment that no highlight package will fully convey. This was a genuinely, authentically, physically contested basketball game of the kind that professional basketball produces in its most intense moments. Not manufactured drama, not performance for the cameras, real competitive aggression meeting real competitive resistance in a building that felt every moment of it. Indiana's players did not back down from that environment. Cunningham was present and competing. Hines-Allen engaged until the officials removed her. Clark played through the technical, through the ejection of her teammate, through the confrontational atmosphere, through a 16-point deficit, and produced 24 points with 3 turnovers and a plus 13 rating. That last sentence is the most important competitive observation from this entire game, and it deserves to be stated that clearly. The environment was maximally difficult. Clark responded with a performance that was both individually impressive and specifically corrective of the most pointed recent criticism directed at her game. The adjustment from Atlanta was real. It was demonstrated under harder conditions than the ones that produced the original problem. And that is a meaningful development in the individual competitive arc of the most important player on this roster. But here is where honest analysis cannot stop, even in the glow of a genuine win. Because the question this victory does not answer is the one that actually matters most for where this team is going. The organizational and competitive commitment to the Clark-centered offensive approach that produced the 4-game winning streak. That approach was working. Clark-central, high-usage, collaborative offensive execution built around her creation. It was producing wins. And then it appeared to shift. The philosophical lean toward reducing Clark's offensive centrality seemed to reassert itself in the Atlanta losses. Now, Indiana is back in the win column. The question is whether the Clark-centered approach returns and stays, or whether the apparent organizational ambivalence about how central she should be reasserts itself now that the immediate pressure of back-to-back losses has been relieved. One win over a 5-12 Phoenix Mercury team, as meaningful as it is for stopping the losing skid and maintaining Indiana's position in the playoff picture, does not resolve the foundational organizational questions that this season has been raising with increasing urgency and decreasing subtlety. It provides breathing room. It provides a moment of reset and stabilization. But the competitive standard that genuine playoff contention requires is considerably higher than what beating a 5-win team demonstrates about a roster's actual ceiling. The gap between Indiana winning tonight and Indiana competing for a championship still exists. It is real, and no single result against a losing opponent closes it. The circus landed correctly. Indiana won, 86-77, and the work that remains is every bit as real as the win that just happened.